Good morning, English martyrs. It's Mrs. Honor here, and today I thought I would start reading you a book. It's a book that I really used to enjoy reading when I was a little bit younger. It's called Groosham, Grange by Anthony Horowitz, and it's a little bit funny, a little bit spooky, probably best if you're in year 4 or older, but I'm sure anyone could enjoy it, so if you want to listen, feel free. I'm going to be reading chapter 1 today, and if you enjoy it, just give it a thumbs up underneath, and I will do the next chapter for you if you like it. So, chapter 1, Expelled. It was dinner time at 3 Winarton Mews. Mr. and Mrs. Elliot were sitting at the dinner table with their only son, David. The meal that night had begun with a large plate of raw cabbage with cheese sauce, because Mr. and Mrs. Elliot never ate meat. The atmosphere in the room was distinctly chilly. That afternoon, the last day of the Christmas term, David had brought home his school report. It had not made pleasant reading. Elliot has not made progress, the maths teacher had written. He can't divide or multiply and will, I fear, end up to very little. Woodwork, the carpentry teacher had written. I wish he would work. If he stayed awake in class, it would be a miracle, the religion teacher had complained. Very poor form, the form master had concluded. He'll never get ahead, the headmaster had agreed. Mr. Elliot had read all these comments with growing anger. First, his face had gone red, then his fingers had gone white, the veins in his neck had gone blue, and his tongue had gone black. Mrs. Elliot had been unsure whether to call a doctor or take a colour photograph, but in the end, after several glasses of whisky, he had calmed down. When I was a boy, he moaned, if my reports weren't first class, my father would lock me in the cupboard for a week without food. Once he chained me behind the car and drove up the M1, and that was only because I came second in equal Latin. Where did we go wrong? Mrs. Elliot sobbed, pulling her mauve-tinted hair. What will the neighbours say if they find out? They'll laugh at me. I'm ruined. My father would have killed me if I'd had a report like this, Mr. Elliot continued. He'd have tied me down to the railway line and waited for the 11:05 from Charing Cross. We could always pretend we haven't got a son, Mrs. Elliot wailed. We could say he's got a rare disease. We could say he fell off a cliff. As you will have gathered from all this, Mr. and Mrs. Elliot were not the best sort of parents you could hope to have. Edward Elliot was a small, fat, bald man with a bristling moustache and a wart on his neck. He was the head of a bank in the City of London. Eileen Elliot was about a foot taller than him, very thin with porcelain teeth and false eyelashes. The Elliots had been married for 29 years and had 7 children. David's 6 elder sisters had all left home. 3 of them had married. 3 of them had emigrated to New Zealand. David had been sitting at the far end of the polished walnut table eating a polished walnut, which was all he had been given. He was short for his age and also rather thin. He was probably the result of being brought up in a vegetarian diet without really liking vegetarian food and vegetables. He had brown hair, green-blue eyes and freckles. David would have described himself as small and ugly. Girls found him cute, which in his mind was even worse. For the last half hour his parents had been talking as if he wasn't there. But as his mother served up the main course, leek and asparagus pie with grated carrot gravy, his mother turned and stared at him with a twitching eye. David, he said, your mother and I have discussed your report and we are not pleased. We are not, Mrs. Elliot agreed, bursting into tears, and I have decided that something must be done. I'll tell you now. If your grandfather were still alive, he'd have hung you upside down by your feet in the refrigerator. That's what he used to do to me if I so much as sneezed without asking permission. But I have decided to be a little less severe. That's right, your father's an angel, Mrs. Elliot sniffed into her lace handkerchief. I have decided, as far as you are concerned, to cancel Christmas this year. There will be no stocking, no presents, no turkey, and no snow. No snow? Mrs. Elliot queried. Not in our garden. If any falls, I shall have it removed. I have already torn December 25th out of my diary. This family will go from December 24th to December 26th. However, we shall have 2 December 27ths to make up for it. I don't understand, Mrs. Elliot said. Don't interrupt, my precious, Mr. Elliot said, hitting her with a spoon. If it weren't for your mother, he went on, I would also give you a sound beating. If you ask me, there's not enough caning in this house. I was caned every day when I was a child. It never did me any harm. It did do you a bit of harm, Mrs. Elliot muttered in a low voice. Nonsense! Mr. Elliot pushed himself away from the table in his electric wheelchair. It made me the man I am. But, darling, you can't walk. A small price to pay for perfect manners. He turned the motor on and rolled towards David with a soft, wheezy noise. Well, he demanded, what have you got to say? David took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been dreading all evening. I can't go back, he said. Can't or won't? Can't. David pulled a crumpled letter out of his pocket and handed it to his father. I was going to tell you, he said. I've been expelled. Expelled? Expelled? Edward Elliot sank into his wheelchair. His hand accidentally struck the controls and he shot backwards into the roaring flames in the fireplace. Meanwhile, Eileen Elliot, who had been about to take a sip of wine, uttered a strangling shriek and spilt the whole glass down her dress. I didn't like it there anyway, David said. He wouldn't normally have dared mention it, but he was already in so much trouble that a little more could hardly hurt. Didn't like it? His father screamed, pouring a jug of water over himself to put out the fire. Beeton College is the best public school in the country. All the best people go to Beeton. Your grandfather went to Beeton. Your great-great-grandfather went to Beeton twice. He liked it so much. And you sit there and tell me. His hand found the carving knife and he might have thrown it at his son. Only Mrs. Beeton had not thrown herself on him first, taking 6 inches of stainless steel into her chest. Why didn't you like it? He rasped as she slid on a heap onto the carpet. David swallowed. He had already marked the door out in the corner of his eye. If things got really bad, he might have to make a dash for the bedroom. I thought it was silly, he said. I didn't like having to say good morning to the teachers in Latin. I didn't like cleaning other boys' boots and wearing a top hat and tails and having to eat standing on one leg just because I was under 13. I didn't like not having any girls there. I thought that was weird. And I really didn't like all the stupid rules. When I was expelled, they cut my tie in half and painted my jacket yellow in front of the whole school. But that's tradition, Mr. Elliot screeched. That's what public schools are all about. I loved it at Breton. It didn't bother me that there were no girls. When I married your mother, I didn't even know she was a girl. It took me 10 years to find out. He reached down and plucked the carving knife out of Mrs. Elliot and used it to tear open the letter. He read, Dear Mr. Elliot, I very much regret to have to tell you that I have been forced to expel your son David for constant and wilful socialism. Yours sincerely, the headmaster, Beeton College. What does it say? Mrs. Elliot moaned as she slowly picked herself up from the floor. Socialism? In 2 trembling hands, Mr. Elliot was holding the letter, which suddenly separated as he tore it in half, his elbow catching his wife in the eye. I don't want to go to public school, David said miserably. I want to go to an ordinary school with ordinary people and... It was as far as he got. His mother had pushed the controls of the wheelchair to fast forward and was and he was now hurtling towards him with the carving knife while his mother screamed in pain. It seemed that he had just driven over her. David made a bolt for the door, reached it, and slammed it shut behind him. If I had talked to my father like that, he'd have made me drink a gallon of petrol and then... That was all he heard. He reached his bedroom and threw himself onto his bed. Downstairs he could just make out the clatter of breaking dinner plates and the muffled shouts of his parents as they blamed each other for what had happened. It was over. It hadn't been as bad as he'd expected, but lying alone in the gloom of his bedroom, David couldn't help wondering if there wasn't going to be worse to come. Okay, that's chapter 1. If you would like to hear chapter 2, just give me a thumbs up and I will record the next chapter. Thanks!